Welcome everyone to the Indo-American Arts Council's annual literary festival. This year we celebrate our sixth year of bringing you authors, thought leaders, and storytellers from around the world. Many of these stories originate from the Indian subcontinent, and today we celebrate these voices that have been shaped by the Indian ethos and experience. In these unprecedented times, our collective shared experiences have uplifted us and reshaped our perspective. For our 2020 festival, we invite our readers, our authors to take center stage to bring people together through the art of storytelling. For our session today, I'd first like to welcome Gita Kothari. Please welcome Geeta on the screen. Geeta is the nonfiction editor of the Canyon Review. Her essay, If You Are What You Eat, Then What Am I, is widely taught in universities and has been reprinted several times, including in the Best American Essays. She's the editor of Did My Mama Like to Dance? And other stories about mothers and daughters, and the author of I Break for Moose and Other Stories. Recent writing has appeared in the Hong Kong Review, Massachusetts Review, Super Review, and more. She teaches at the University of Pittsburgh and in the MFA program at the Carlow University. Welcome, Geeta.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Lit Fest. Thank you so much for participating and for today's conversation. For today's book talk, Geeta will be in conversation with Sejal Shah, the author of the debut essay collection, This Is One Way to Dance. This book was named in 19 most anticipated and recommended lists, including in the New York Times, PEN America, Rumpus, and Self, Bish Media, Electric Literature, The Million, and more. Her stories and essays have appeared in Guernica, The Guardian, Kenyon Review, Lit Hub, Long Reads, and others. The recipient of a 2018 New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Fiction, Sejal recently completed a collection of linked stories. She's also been writing about invisible disability, neurodiversity, and mental health. Sejal teaches at the Rainier Writing Workshop, Low Residency MFA program at the Pacific Lutheran University. She lives with her family in Rochester, New York. Welcome, Sejal, to the IAAC Literary Festival with your book. It's an amazing collection of essays, and I am super happy to have you both here talking about the book today. With the book itself explores identity, culture, family, and how you identify yourselves in this global modern world. And I know both of you have written so much about cultural identity, and it's a topic that's also very close to my heart. Like, I grew up in India, moved here, and so the where do we all fit in, and how do we fit in with different cultures and different exposures is a question that's, I think, on everybody's mind these days. And it's so nice to hear both of you, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So thank you so much. And over to you, Geeta, to go ahead and delve further into this topic.
Thanks, Suman. Thanks for having us here. I am so excited, Sejal, to be on the screen with you. I wish this had been in person because I feel like I've been waiting for this book for a long time. And, our friendship goes back nearly 20 years. And I have always been struck by that moment when we met and how it's rare that someone approaches me in the hallway and we become basically lifelong friends.
Essay, If You Are What You Eat, Then What Am I, in Best American Essays when I was in graduate school in 2000. And I loved it so much. And I saw that you were speaking there, and I wanted to tell you how much that essay meant to me. And I never thought about, I never thought we would become friends.
It was such a chance meeting. I mean, we were at this really super crazy conference with thousands of people. And I think you just approached me in the hallway. I don't even know how you found me. maybe because there were only like 4 Indians in that space anyway. I mean, usually in creative writing spaces, you can spot the other Indian, especially at that time, because there's so few of us, or were. Right.
Yeah, I think there were 2 panels I wanted to go to at the same time, and one was yours. And so I was at one panel, and then I ran over to yours and waited to talk to you after that.
Well, I don't know. I didn't know what you were writing then. Were you still in graduate school? Had you already started that move to prose from poetry? Because you've talked about starting in poetry and then moving over to prose. But to me, the lines between fiction, poetry, and nonfiction are really blurred in your work. And I'm wondering when that transition started.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in 2003, I'd already finished my MFA at UMass Amherst, and I went there to study with Aga Shahid Ali, whose poetry I loved. But I had applied to programs in fiction. So I grew up, reading voraciously across genres. I loved fairy tales. I loved Amar Chitraketu comics, Little House on the Prairie, Nancy Drew, The Great Gatsby. And I knew that I was writing poetry and publishing it even in high school. And then I studied poetry with Frank Bedart at Wellesley College. But I also started to write stories there. I started to write fiction. And so when I applied to graduate school, I think in part because my mother said, "What are you going to do with a poetry degree?" And it seemed like with a fiction degree, maybe, with a novel or something. Right? I mean, our immigrant parents, how are you going to support yourself? So I took poetry workshops, but my MFA was in fiction. And
interesting.
I also took a lot of classes I took classes in anthropology, Asian American literature, dance classes, writers of color. And so I was trying to educate myself, I think, from many different disciplines. I'd grown up studying Bharatanatyam and Kuchipudi and Indian classical dance and modern dance, and that was a big part of my background too.
So all those influences show up in here in this book, which is, you change the title to "This Is One Way to Dance" from the original title. And it's really interesting to me how all those influences come to bear on the work over a period of time. I mean, these essays were written over a long period of time. And I'm wondering if you could talk about influences that people might be surprised by, the things that really stuck with you. Because I remember reading this and thinking, oh, I didn't know she liked those writers, or, you know what I mean? And I remember reading some of your interviews and thinking, oh, this makes a lot of sense. And actually, there was a moment in one of these essays where you sounded like you were channeling Audre Lorde. So it was really interesting. Yeah. And I should have marked it to tell you, because I was like, oh, that sounds like an Audre Lorde moment.
Yeah, we talked about this yesterday, like the Black writers in particular who influenced us. I read Audre Lorde's essay, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, when I was an undergrad. And that essay really changed my life and was one of a touchstone for me as I continued along as a writer. Maxine Hung Kingston, The Woman Warrior, Toni Morrison, Sula. That novel was really important to me and her work. And in graduate school, I also read Bell Hooks, and in particular, talking back about becoming a writer and having a voice as a writer and what it meant to grow up in a community where you're not encouraged to talk back. And this was almost the epigraph to my book. In Black communities and diverse ethnic communities, women have not been silent. Their voices can be heard. Certainly for Black women, our struggle has not been to emerge from silence into speech, but to change the nature and direction of our speech, to make a speech that compels listeners, one that is heard. And then later in this essay, writing was a way to capture speech, to hold on to it, keep it close.
I find that so interesting. Did you feel you were not encouraged to speak up when you were growing up? Did you feel there was a kind of silencing that went on in the community at large, not necessarily? I mean, I remember I was living with my boyfriend in Pittsburgh, and my mother said, "What if the Indian community finds out?" And I was actually from New York, so I didn't know what community she was talking about. And, except not by total coincidence, I ran into someone who happened to be the sister of my mother's best friend when she first came to New York. So in some ways, her fears proved prophetic, but in other ways, not really, because I didn't care about this woman, and there was no larger community that I understood. But there was a real fear for her that I would be shunned, or for transgressing. So I'm kind of curious, and I think that once that fear is sort of implanted in you, it can become silencing in other ways. And I'm wondering if that's why bell hooks appeal to you.
Yeah, I'm going to just write that down. I usually need to see a question.
Sorry.
No, it's a great question. I think it's really true. I did grow up in this very close-knit Indian American community in Rochester. In particular, there was a Gujarati community, but Rochester is small enough that we knew the Bengalis and the South Indians. My best friend from growing up was Telugu speaking. In my town, who I went to school with, and so there really was this sense of like, this is our community, and this is how you. I think there were these unspoken rules about it within that. And I was always encouraged to write. I think my goal was to be a professor or a librarian or a dancer, but to live a life that was around books and where there was space to write. And I think my parents gave me a big gift in our family. I was the only one born in the US. My mother was born in Uganda and grew up in Kenya. My dad and my brother were born in India. And I felt like English was given to me as mine. So I felt like write anything in English but I also came across, I think, moments where it was difficult to write about difficult things that happen in a life, even within English. So I think that was part of my project. And one of the things that was so wonderful for me about finding your work was seeing a form that made sense to me. In your essay, a collection of stories that were connected but also distinct, and they created a larger story.
Yeah, that was a form born out of desperation. But, when my mom read that essay, she never forgave me for describing her like a little bird. She was very, very offended. And which brings me back to this thing about community and family. And how did your family react to this book, or, either specific members or the community at large? Have you had any reactions from your family members to this, or to your essay in the Kenyan Review, which went viral last year when it came out, and was a topic of conversation for a lot of people?
Well, those are great questions. I mean, the last year has been really challenging. My dad was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia last October. So the whole time I was preparing for the book and doing copy edits, and he's been going through chemo. He's been sick, and I had imagined my book launch as a wedding do-over. My wedding was so difficult for me that I thought, okay, at least I'll have a party. And the book, for the book, my husband was amazing. He really helped me produce the book and kind of keep me on track. He was a competitive tennis player, and he's a middle school teacher, and also he coached tennis. And I think that he was just like, you have to go for it. And what's most important are your words and not what anyone else thinks. And that was really helpful. Of course, then we had a pandemic, but the cover is the outfit that I tried on for my wedding in the store in New Jersey. I didn't buy it and I wish I had. So it was this it was me spinning in a Janyajori. I think I'd published some of these essays earlier, and so they'd had a life in the world, and then I revised them in making this book. And my mother told me she felt that she had failed as a mother after reading the book. And I had said to her, if there's anything you don't like, I think it's better that I don't know, because there's nothing I can do about it at this point. And, my dad was in the hospital. So she told my brother, who told me. So I've had some family members reach out, and some of my cousins have been, really wonderful and told me what they liked, and others haven't said anything. I think I didn't write it for them. I'm sorry that it was hard for my mother, but I wrote the essays that I felt like I needed to write, that were about not just my experience, but about, I think, growing up in a country that didn't really recognize Asian Americans and our history, and about, I think, particularly stories that were not often told, right? If it wasn't Jhumpa Lahiri, that I felt like there wasn't space for other kinds of stories. And I knew a lot of Indian Americans growing up, and I didn't see us reflected. Also, where I grew up, Rochester, Western New York, it's not, there are actually a lot of wonderful writers here, but it's not a literary landscape, I think, that's recognized in American literature. Mm-hmm. So it was challenging to put the book out. I'm really grateful that it's gotten the recognition that it has, but it was definitely a process. Thanks for asking.
I have so many questions to ask you after that one. So first question is, what surprised you about the book now that it came out? What reactions or what events or what things have really kind of surprised you in a good way?
Well, I just realized I didn't answer the question you asked me about the neurodiversity, invisible disability essay. I wrote about my experiencing depression and living with a mood disorder and going through academia with that. I had never intended to show that to my parents. And the book was already under review and production when that essay came out, which you edited.
Yeah, that was a fun collaboration, actually. I mean, I so rarely get to edit in my capacity as editor. And so that was a really fun collaboration. I remember talking to you about it and really how it evolved in those conversations.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience. And that essay, it went viral, and it had short stories of mine that I'd written, as a fiction writer. I was a fiction writer as an academic when I was teaching full time. But it was sort of telling the story that hadn't been told around that. When I was expected to do a lot of diversity work at institutions, be the brown body in a white institution, to show that they had diversity, which also just was increased the amount of work that really didn't count toward tenure. So that essay went viral, and I've heard from hundreds of people I know, people I didn't know. And one of the things that was surprising to me, I felt like really that was a different retelling of the years that my book covers. This Is One Way to Dance is a certain journey through a certain part of my life. It's not complete. And I think once the book was under production, it gave me an opportunity to think about what had I left out of the book and to write into some of those silences. So the sexual harassment I experienced in graduate school from a prominent fiction writer, and there's more that I've written about in that essay. But what surprised me was that some people wrote and said, "Oh, I was disappointed that that essay wasn't in the book."
Right.
And my parents even said that they loved that essay, which I didn't expect, but I think they felt like I was giving voice to, I think there's been a lot of suffering in our community because I don't think that that our mental health and the way that we tell stories, our communities, the family structure, I don't think that's understood in Western psychiatry and psychology. And I think that, and just medical racism, in the field of medicine. So I think they saw that the importance of that essay, I think in moving that conversation forward. And I really appreciated that, but I didn't expect that. I think it had to do when these pieces were published. And I see that work as being part of the next book for me.
So what is the next book going to be, since you've raised the question? I'm curious.
Thanks,
I think
Geeta.
You have readers who are probably waiting for the next book already, and probably want to know.
I have a story collection. The stories that were in, some of them were I excerpted from in Even If You Can't See It, in the Invisible Disability essay. So that story collection, I'd like to add images to it, because I realize that that's often what I'm trying to do in my, I think in anything, essays, poetry, fiction, that I'm working off of these artifacts, cultural artifacts and objects. So the story collection, and then I think writing more about mental health and about my own experience of being misdiagnosed and not being able to make my life and experience legible.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, I see this book as the beginning of a process of claiming a space as a writer, and maybe being that writer that you would have wanted when you were younger, and looking for, writers who reflected your experience. And so I'm going to ask you the hard question that I asked you before. Which of these essays would your younger self have wanted to read? Which is a roundabout way of saying which of these essays would appeal to, someone who was like you then, reading yourself into these stories.
That's always a hard question for me.
It is. I know. It's like the question about which is your favorite essay.
Right.
You can answer either one.
I think three. Curriculum, which is a really brief lyric essay. Betsy Tacy Sejal Tib, which is about growing up reading Amrita Kapta comics and Little House on the Prairie and Anne of Green Gables, and just all the books I read growing up and loved. In fact, I still have this book from my fourth grade teacher, Tiger on the Mountain, which is about a Tamil family in India. I think written by someone who's not Indian. But I read it so often that she gave me the classroom copy, and then I ended up marrying a Tamil guy. But
has he read it?
I don't think he has. And we grew up 2 miles from each other, but we're in different school districts. No, I'd like to write about the experience of reading that book and what that was like for me. So I think curriculum, because I wrote about parts of my life, I don't know, that essay's really resonated with a lot of people too. And I also wrote about going through a breakdown in my 20s without giving a lot of background about it. And I wrote about my mother, as I often do. And about, I think, trying to figure out what it meant to have a parent who'd grown up in British East Africa, and but here I was still seen as Indian. I had, and I have never been to Kenya. So that essay, and then my essay about going to the Burning Man Festival.
I love that essay.
I
love the title. Just the title itself is fantastic.
Thank you. That right, this Black preacher on WDKX in Rochester. So it's that's the station named for Frederick Douglass, who's buried here. At WDKX. It's Malcolm X and Martin Luther King.
Wow, that is such a, I was thinking all the titles in this collection, your titles are really, really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, my students always ask, how do you decide a title? How do you figure it out? And for me, the process is completely onerous. I mean, often I'll write out 50 things before I figure out the right title. But that title and its sourcing worked so well in this essay. And curriculum, I think, is kind of a perfect triptych. I mean, it's 3 parts, right? And
yeah,
it's amazing how much you pack into such a short piece. And I have to assume that's part of your poetry training, that you can make moves with language that those of us who are embedded in narrative, like who are so attached to prose and don't read poetry. I do read poetry, but I'm just saying that poetry teaches us an economy of language and how to use it really effectively. And I think your shorter pieces really, really show that. They're just really dense and imagistic. And I was just wondering, I assume you still read poetry, right?
I do, but here, what do I want to say? Thank you. I haven't been reading poetry as much recently, but yeah, my training as a poet, and I think what was difficult for me in the genre of fiction was the assumption that you couldn't make some of those associative leaps. But within poetry, my lines were getting longer. I felt like really what I was trying to do was tell a story, but stories that are based on these objects. I'm looking over here because I have the objects from curriculum. I have the embroidery.
Oh,
in fact,
wow.
Here, hold on. So sometimes when I've done a reading, I will hold those up. So I have my mother's eyeglasses.
Those are so much from that period.
I know, right? They're amazing. I have pictures of her with that. I have this map of British East Africa.
Wow. That's an old map.
Yep. But I grew up looking at these objects and thinking about them and, wanting to know about my parents' lives and why we had what we had. This is the embroidery. And so that essay came out of, I didn't know what to call it, right? It was, it came out of a workshop I took with the writer Carol Mazo. And I think it just opened a door for me because I wasn't thinking about who am I trying to explain this to? I think it was talking back to school, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like curriculum, how you're told, how we're told what's important by what we study or don't study and who's making those decisions. But I felt like it gave me a place to play with my strengths as a writer. And I love titles. I feel like that's actually something that I'm really good at and that I enjoy. Finding the right title.
I have to say that comes from the poetry because there's an economy to the titles that they do so much and they do so much of the work of grounding the reader. And also, when I was reading the collection, sometimes I'd go back to the title while I was in the middle of an essay and just to see how it was resonating. And I think this is something I have a hard time explaining to students as well, is your title can do so much work for you and the reader. They're not just an afterthought. They are actually the thing that invites the reader into the piece, but also that helps ground you as a writer. Like that once you discover the title, you know what you're doing in some ways.
Right. Was there a particular title that was
Yes.
helpful for you that way?
Well, your wilderness is not permanent, I thought worked really well on so many levels, because the metaphor, right, as a metaphor for the life you were leading at that moment in Burning Man, it really resonated, and it resonated for me personally because one of the ways I've been taught in meditation to deal with anxiety is to remember this is not a permanent situation, right?
Right.
So you're not going to be lost permanently. I have a terror of getting lost. I have no sense of direction. I grew up in New York City where everything's laid out for you perfectly. And if you look at the East River, you know you're heading east. And if you look towards the Hudson, you know you're heading west, and you don't really have to think much about it unless you're in the village. And
that's right.
I live in Pittsburgh where there's no logic. Everything's built around the hills. So this idea of being lost it really resonated for me. But I also thought it resonated, you were cut loose from your job, from everything you were used to. So that title really struck me. And also I loved There Is No Mic Here, because again, that also worked on this metaphorical level as well. It's not just about your brother, but it's about names, and it spoke so much to this yearning, and also the interesting difference between you and your brother, right? Your brother choosing this name, and you're rejecting it in the title as well. You're rejecting that idea of changing names, and I think that's really important. It was important for me. I never thought about changing my name, but I was teased a lot when I was growing up. And so, I could feel what he was feeling, but at the same time, also wanting to reject that whole idea. So when someone slams the door and says, there's no mic here, it's like saying, no, we're not going to change our name to suit your purposes.
Yeah. So. The writer Donovan Hahn read my book, and we were talking. He read. He saw that the Burning Man essay, "Your Wilderness is Not Permanent," he thought was an echo of Who's Indian, which used to be because they're both about. I don't think we ever talked about this, or maybe we did. That I had this real fear of getting lost too, and I ended up living with my extended family because I. At 6 years old, I said, yeah, can I stay here in California? So I was without my parents and my brother, but with my grandparents and my aunts and uncles and my cousins for second grade. And I remember realizing a 6-year-old doesn't know what a year is.
No.
Right. So that's... And that, right, growing up in Rochester, where I don't think things are that well marked, and it's quite segregated, actually, socioeconomically and racially, thinking about, what it feels like to traverse these spaces. And then Boston, which is completely bonkers to drive in, right?
People drive backwards in Boston. I actually saw that.
Yeah, I mean, I was afraid of I had this fear of getting lost in New York also, like before smartphones. But yes, things are marked in lots of places, which is really helpful. But I really appreciated that Donovan saw that. I hadn't seen that echo because Your Wilderness is Not Permanent was added to the collection so late. I only finished it last year.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I really struggled with that essay. I started it in 2012, and it was just really unwieldy, and I couldn't figure out how to make it work. And I thought that what was appealing about it was being out in the desert and the spectacle of Burning Man, right, which is a festival where you have to drag all your own food and your water for 10 days and you're in the desert. But really, I realized, and this was through working with another editor, Bradford Morrow at Conjunctions, which published the essay first, that I think in that process of collaborative editing, I realized, or the essay took me to where I saw that really it was about being lost in my whole life.
Yeah. I love essays that work on multiple levels, or that as you're writing, you uncover what the essay is really about. I just love that. And for me as a writer, when that happens, it just feels like a gift, you know, like I've been slaving away at this essay and suddenly, whoa, that's what it's about.
Well, since I had written these essays over a long period of time, I hadn't thought about, you know, I lived in New York City for 6 years during that time. New York City is not in these essays that much because I was teaching full time and on the tenure track, and I just didn't have a lot of time. I was writing these shorter pieces, but that essay I realized afterwards was the only essay in which I talked about my contract not being renewed, failing. I had hitched my whole life on this career and identity and what that meant. And I think the reader response kind of shocked me because it was people, again, Indians and non-Indians, just I think everyone, people connecting to, because this happens to everyone at some point, right? Something will happen that'll set you back, or you get sick, or something will happen that throws your feet out from under you. And then what do? How do you live with it? How do you move on?
Right. And I think that really appeals to readers. And I think that's what's ultimately, I'm going to wrap this up now, but ultimately what's great about this essay collection is you write from the heart. And I think people really underestimate how hard that is to do. And I think that's what people have been responding to, is these moments of recognition at an emotional level. And, you know, I say that as someone who struggles to get to those tender moments and those difficult moments. I know how hard it is for writers to put it out on the page, but also to put it all out on the page artfully. So, you know, the essays, like I said, function on many levels. But I think what I'm seeing from the response that I've seen on social media and from readers is that there's a response to both the craft, but also to this these emotional moments in the story where people connect and feel seen.
Thank you. I mean, I feel like it's about craft as much as heart, but also that essay I hesitated on because I knew by putting it into the book, it's possible that my parents would read it or our community. But you know, the writing, we've talked about this, Geeta, writing is really hard. I mean, it doesn't come easily to me. Right. So I felt like it was a really good essay. I was proud of it. And I wasn't, to me, that mattered more, the work of the essay and the work it had taken to get there, more than what someone else might think of it. That I was proud of that work. And so I didn't run it through the filter of how will this seem to various people in my life, because that wasn't the goal of the book. And that wasn't my goal as a writer. It was about to write honestly about difficult things, about shame and failure and a plan B when your life doesn't go as you might have hoped.
Well, I think you did that really successfully, and I'm so excited for you. And once again, want to publicly congratulate you for this beautiful book that is really hitting home for so many people. So.
Thank you, Geeta. Before we go, I want to just this is Geeta's story collection, I Break for Moose, which came out in 2017. Story collections don't get the attention they deserve. And this is a really wonderful book, and you should get it, whoever's out there. And then How We Show Up. Mia Birdsong grew up in Rochester, reclaiming family, friendship, and community. Yes, because I think we're at a moment now in 2020 where we're talking about how do we define community and kinship beyond just ethnic, racial origins, but how do we, I mean, what's going on in this country, and how do we extend our ideas of community? So it's a really important book. I really recommend that. And Geeta's book, I Break for Moose.
And Sejal's. All right. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
So thank you so much. It was such an engaging discussion, and most of that your essays, your words speak so much to me, and it just gives putting into words what a lot of my thoughts are, and I'm sure a lot of people will also feel the same way. So thank you both. Thank you, Geeta, and thank you, Sejal, for this intimate conversation. Before we go, Sejal, I had just one question for you. I know that you did speak about dance in the book, and but I still wanted to know more from you, because when I came across your work, and initially my first impression, and at that time for the Indo-American Arts Council, we were doing our Erasing Borders Dance Festival, and I thought maybe it's something to do with the Indian dance form. So, but when I read it, of course, it's still about dance, but it's also speaking very personally to you in different ways. And I know it's very important. You have it on your cover, and the dress that you have on the cover is also something that you would wear for that, the Garba dance. So can you speak a little bit about it?
Yes, thanks for that question. So the book was originally, I'd called the manuscript Things People Say, which was based off of a short essay of mine called Things People Said, an essay in 7 steps. And it was about things people said about my wedding. And I realized when my book went through, at university presses, it goes through anonymous peer review. And the reader report was very positive. But one person said, I think I would caution against using a title that focuses on other people's words. These essays are so strong. And so that made me consider the title Things People Say. And I grew up studying dance very seriously. Kuchipudi and Bharatanatyam. I had an Arangetram when I was 17. And then I studied modern dance. And so I was, and I'd written about that in the essay Matrimonials, which I took the end of, which was about going to Indian weddings. The very last piece in the book is called Voice Texting with My Mother. And I wanted to show that the stories we tell are also a way to dance. And the importance of this is one way to dance is to say, you're right, with the cover, I wanted something that looked Gujarati, particularly marrying into a South Indian family. And I've spent more time in South India than in Gujarat. I wanted to push back against the idea of, here, there's just one Indian story, that each of us moves through the world in a different way. In dance class, even if you're doing the same steps, they look different. They have different energy. So if I can share a little bit here.
Yeah, please.
Saris and sorrows and weddings are one. These are stories to myself and to you, reader, writer, mother tongue. These are letters to myself and to my mother, words to my grandmother who taught me to dance. These are stories we tell ourselves, stories we tell each other. Weddings are stories we tell ourselves. We are stories we tell each other. By wedding, I mean an occasion to dance. By occasion to dance, I mean joy. I mean to move. Here is my booth at the carnival. What will stay and what will go. Indian, American, and girl. The body, bones, raced, erased. Stories are an argument between some words. Weddings are a series of stories, a circle of stories. Our bodies, streets, intersections. We wear our sorrows, they wear us. They wind themselves around us. This conversation still bears repeating. A circle of words is my companion. A circle of words with my husband. A circle of words with myself. Words are surfacing. This is one way to dance. Words are rising. This is how to dance.
Wonderful. Oh, I love it. And it's so moving. Thank you so much for sharing your words and sharing your time today.
Thank you so much, Suman and Indo-American Arts Council.
Thank you. For our audience who's watching today, you can follow Sejal on Twitter at Sejal Shah Writes. And One Way to Dance. You can buy it on bookshop.org, where you support local, businesses. You can look for your local bookstore and buy her book. And so Sejal is on Twitter at Sejal Shah Writes, and Geeta is on Twitter at Kothari_Geeta. And you can buy Sejal's book and Geeta's book on bookshop.org. Support your local businesses. Find your nearest bookstore on that site and go ahead and buy those books and do yourself one big favor. Thank you, and bye, Sejal. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Neeli Lakhani, IAAC Literary Festival Director. I want to thank you for joining our award-winning authors and their wondrous stories. IAAC is a 501c nonprofit. Programs like the one you just watched happen because of contributions from generous folks like you. Please donate to the IAAC so that we can support our artists and sustain our cultural programs. It is simple to donate by visiting the IAAC website at iaac.us. Learn about the insider benefits that membership gives you. On behalf of the entire IAAC board, stay safe and see you at our next event. Thank you.